What if I told you some animals declared extinct have miraculously come back to life? Not through science fiction, but through real life discoveries that have stunned scientists and given us a little more hope for the natural world. So, how does a species rise from the dead, and what does it mean for the future of conservation?
What's loud enough to fill the forest with sound, but small enough to fit in the palm of your hand? And what woodland creatures go completely unnoticed unless you know the special place to look for them?
Have you ever seen a wild animal dunking its food in water and thought, "Aw, it's washing its dinner"? Turns out, it's not what you think.
So, for this week's question of the week, I was thinking about some of our past episodes, and every once in a while we touch on endangered or threatened species, or sometimes, unfortunately, even those who go extinct. And the question I have for you this week, Dustin, is: has a bird species ever reappeared that you know of after having been declared extinct?
That definitely does happen from time to time with birds and other species, and we call this a Lazarus species because it seemingly has risen from the dead.
All right, so that's interesting, and that term is even interesting. Can you give us an example of a bird that has been a Lazarus species here in North America?
Sure, so keep in mind sometimes something gets declared extinct in the wild but still lives in captivity, and the whooping crane is a great example. By the 1940s, there were fewer than 20 birds left due to hunting and habitat loss. Most of these were in captivity, so it had been declared extinct in the wild. But by the 40s, that number was so small that when a population was rediscovered in the wild, thanks to extensive conservation efforts, like protecting their habitats and even using ultralight aircrafts to help reteach them their historic migration routes, their numbers have grown to over 800 individuals today.
That's so weird and interesting to me that they used aircrafts to teach these birds how to migrate again. So you used an example of the whooping crane in North America, but what about other birds that may have come back from being extinct? I had asked you to do some research on that. What did you find?
Yeah, there's a number of examples. Let's talk first about one called the Madagascar Pochard. This was a bird last seen in the wild in 1991 in a lake called Lake Alatra at Madagascar's largest wetland. But after multiple years of no sightings, it was declared extinct in the early 2000s. This one went extinct because it relied on freshwater wetlands, which had been severely degraded or destroyed due to agriculture, deforestation, and overgrazing by livestock. There simply wasn't enough habitat for them. In addition, some non-native fish species, such as tilapia, that were being raised or introduced into that lake really decimated the aquaculture that was supporting them in that area. So these fish outcompeted with the pocards for food, disrupting their resources and the natural ecology. But in 2006, they were rediscovered in a more remote lake that they had previously not been known to exist in.
Oh, wow. It makes me kind of feel a little strange about the fact that I happen to really like tilapia, but okay.
Most tilapia are farm raised these days, so you can eat tilapia with a clear conscience for the most part.
All right, good. Good to know.
But ongoing conservation efforts, including captive breeding for the Madagascar pochard and habitat restoration, are helping them to recover.
Oh, that's good news.
Another one is the Bermuda petrel. Now, the petrel is an interesting family of birds that a lot of people don't know about, but they're essentially ocean-going pelagic birds that spend most of their life flying around out over the ocean, so something sailors might be familiar with, but a lot of us landlubbers aren't in tune with. So although petrels live their life flying out over the ocean mostly, they absolutely have to get on land in order to reproduce. So that creates their most vulnerable time in their life cycle. And the Bermuda petrel was declared extinct in the 1620s after European colonization into the Caribbean islands because of a number of things that people had brought onto the islands, specifically rats that came over on ships were eating the eggs and the young babies. Also, pigs that were brought in by settlers were sort of digging up and nosing through all the soil, which was disrupting that breeding habitat for the petrel. And cats, domestic house cats that were brought over, were good for keeping control of mice, but they also kept control of other things. The law of unintended consequences, so to speak. But then they were actually rediscovered in 1951 on one of the remote Bermuda Islands. So luckily, they hadn't suffered from the fate that we thought.
Wait a minute. So I want to think about the math here. So they were declared extinct in the 1620s, and then nobody thought these birds existed until 1951. That whole time they were like flying under the radar, pun intended, and people just thought they didn't exist anymore.
Yeah, so some of these petrel species might have looked like other petrels, and so maybe they were mistaken that way. And to be honest, unless you're an ornithologist, you probably wouldn't recognize that specific species. You might just think it's a bird or a seagull or whatever.
Still, I mean, that time frame, talk about rising from the dead, right?
Right, and because they're a bird that flies over the ocean all the time, right? They're spending all their time out at sea, so they're not really abundantly present around people. So that certainly contributed to that math.
Interesting. All right, so they find them in 1951. I would imagine that would have been big news within the scientific community. And then what? Like, have they been supporting these birds since
Yeah, that's
then?
when the conservation efforts started. So they had captive breeding programs in order to bring them back, habitat restoration efforts in order to give them a place to live, and then community engagement to help reduce further future human impact. You know, keep your cats indoors or actively remove threats like cats and rats from those islands if they were discovered there again.
So there's 2 species. Do you have any other
Sure.
examples?
There's another petrel called the New Zealand storm petrel. This one had been last recorded in the 1800s, and having had no confirmed sightings of that bird for over 150 years, it was presumed extinct. And the reasons for its decline were very similar also rats and cats, but also stoats and weasels in that ecology were, you know, eating the eggs and eating the young babies when they did have to be on land to reproduce. And then finally, deforestation and land development of coastal areas, right? People like to build a house or a hotel on a coastline, but there are real ecological impacts to doing that. So luckily, we've gotten more in tune with that in, you know, modern times.
Okay. So we went 150 years thinking that these birds didn't exist anymore. So what year were they rediscovered?
I believe it was 2003 or so. They were found and identified to be present again. And that was a shock to the scientific community because New Zealand and Australia in particular are sort of well in tune with. They're heavily studied because there's a lot of endemic birds to those islands because they're so remote and isolated from the rest of the world. So in order to have found something new, it was you know well documented.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I would imagine they're doing conservation efforts with those birds as well?
They are, same kind of thing, right? They're working to identify and protect the nesting areas that they have. There's active ornithological research sites in those places. Controlling invasive predators is key to keeping that habitat safe. And then finally, monitoring populations to better understand their life cycle and other threats that they're encountering and keep track of their numbers to make sure they're always heading in the right direction.
Thinking about all this, I guess my question for you is, why do you think scientists sometimes like get it wrong? No offense to scientists. I'm part of the scientific community myself, but why do you think sometimes a species is declared extinct when it's not?
Well, this is a huge challenge because there's a lot more species out there than there are people that are researching species dynamics and stuff like that. So it's impossible to keep close track on every single species. And then, of course, the scarcer they get, the harder it is. So it's sort of like a hockey stick graph where, you know, the further down the road you get, the more difficult it gets until, you know, they ultimately aren't able to find any proof that something is still alive. Many of these animals live in extremely remote locations or really hard to access locations. So it gets financially and time difficult to be able to find these species. And sometimes there's actually a disappearance from the fossil record. So, for example, there was an ancient fish called the coelacanth that had been discovered in fossils 66 million years old and older, but disappeared from the fossil record after the 66 million year ago mark. But in the late 1930s, a coelacanth was caught by a fisherman off the southern coast of Africa, and it was determined it hadn't actually been extinct. And no one really knows why there are no fossils between 66 million years ago and current times, but that's actually what happened. So that was a unique story. And then sometimes it's just that sightings are so few and far between, or they're mistaken for other species. And not all regions have the funding or the expertise in order to be able to track down all of these different species and keep tabs on them. But with new tools like game cameras and GPS tracking and DNA research, it's allowed us to better focus our efforts to be able to see and research where something is and know that that research is occurring in the proper area for habitat and stuff like that.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. What I love about this particular question of the week is it's a really hopeful topic. I feel like sometimes with some of our content on our various channels, we're talking about the need for conservation because we're watching the decline of species. But to be talking about the surprises of finding out that some of them really are still here is really cool.
And to know that the work people are doing is actually having a positive impact, and you can both see that impact and measure its progress over time is very encouraging.
So I want to build on what you just said. So we have a lot of nature lovers that watch our videos and interact with us on our various channels who talk about not only their enthusiasm for nature and wildlife, but the active hobbies and activities that they do to engage with nature and wildlife. So for those who are watching this video, what can they do to kind of help conservation efforts like this so that hopefully we rediscover more good news about the animals that are around us every day?
Yeah, it's about contributing, and you can contribute with your time, talent, and resources. So sometimes some people who are able to get out there and contribute to citizen science, like eBird and iNaturalist and different counting and observing reporting activities that are out there in the sort of crowdsourcing space. But then there's also the paying attention and being aware of what's going on in the conservation world so that you can tailor your behavior to that thing. Obviously, in the modern era, there's different choices we have about an internal combustion car or an electric car or using your bicycle that all can have impacts. And about where you spend your tourism dollars, whether it's an ecotourism or if you want to fly someplace or not, they can have impacts. All that can make a huge difference. And of course, being aware and being intentional about where you send your sort of charity funds too, right? I like to pick one or two charities every year, or causes, not necessarily charities, but causes every year, and funnel our money that way too. So
I would also say that there are free things that people can do, even if you don't have access to wild places where you could be capturing citizen science data, or even if you don't have a lot of funds for charity work. And one of those is sharing information. Most of us have social media nowadays. So when you come across content like ours, which I would love for you to share with your channels, but also Audubon, any of the conservation groups, even when you're just scrolling through your feed and you see a conservation news story through the Associated Press or other sources, share that amongst your friends, and your networks. Because I do feel that that information sharing is a really important part as well. And it costs us nothing to do that work.
Yeah, the Nature Conservancy is a really good one too to be in tune with, whether you contribute to them financially or just stay in tune with the ecology news of the day through that organization is really good.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to those of you who are watching this, I'm curious to know, were you surprised by any of these rediscoveries? I personally was surprised by some of the timelines and how long those timelines were of us thinking things were extinct and rediscovering them. I'm also curious for birders who are watching this video. Have any of you spotted a rare bird? What was your experience in those situations? Those are really exciting stories, and we love to read about them in the comments and talk to you guys about that for sure.
Yeah, and this week, I almost forgot, we almost had a true Lazarus species. So the Tasmanian tiger was a species of marsupial in the island of Tasmania that had the last known individual went extinct from the Cincinnati Zoo in 1936. And there's a group in Australia called the proper name for the Tasmanian tiger is the thylacine. So there's a group called the Thylacine Awareness Group of Australia, and they believed that they had seen 3 Tasmanian tigers, a mother, a father, and a cub, got video evidence of it, and were prepared to do a press release this week and announced that it was coming while they were waiting for the experts to take a good look at their video. Unfortunately, the experts came back and said it wasn't actually a Tasmanian tiger, that they were Tasmanian panda melons, which is sort of a wallaby-like marsupial. So it was close, but no cigar. But the thylacine also might be one of the first species that gets recreated from DNA evidence. So there's work in that area happening too.
Okay, then. All right. Well, if any of you watching have any questions that you would like us to address in our Question of the Week series, this is a reminder from me to you to drop your questions in the comments. And also make sure that you're subscribing and turning on your notifications so that you know when our research on upcoming topics has dropped on our YouTube channel.
Picture this. It's a rainy night in early spring. The forest is dark, but if you look closely, you'll see something extraordinary. Scores of creatures, salamanders, frogs, and toads are emerging from the soil, crawling, hopping their way to vernal pools located throughout the forest. This is the big night, one of nature's most magical events. I've been lucky enough to witness this event firsthand, even with our daughter. We'll put on our headlamps, grab our rain gear, and head out to the forest to see such an incredible, albeit short distance migration. It's like stepping into a hidden world that people often don't get to see. So planning has already started for this year's local event. It should happen in the next few weeks. Big nights don't happen just in the forest, though. When they occur, it's about having the right conditions for these species to emerge and make their way to the vernal pools where they, as one modern poet said it, like to get their friction on. Mm-hmm. But big night efforts are often about supporting them in road crossings because that can be really dangerous. So there's local conservation groups all across the country that when conditions are right, they get those mass emails out and they deploy groups to known streets that have crossings near vernal pools, but also have a lot of traffic in those hours from when it gets dark until the traffic dies down. And so it's important to get out there and help those amphibians cross the road whenever you can. Help ensure cars are aware of what's going on so that they slow down and go like 5 miles an hour per less until they're out of the danger zone. And for the ones that don't make it, it's important to count and remove any dead amphibians from the road so that we can keep track of the data and know what the population volumes look like year to year and if those efforts are being successful.
I love how kind humans can be in areas like this. I really find it heartwarming. And I know that Dustin and our daughter have loved this event and going out in early spring for a long time to check out the vernal pools and see all of the action. But for today's discussion, I want to pause for a moment because I think we should start with the basics. So Dustin, not everybody may know or understand what a vernal pool is and why they're so important. So could you start by kind of walking us through some of that?
Sure. Vernal pools are small, temporary, seasonal ponds. Think of it as more like a deep puddle that forms in the spring from snowmelt and the spring rains. But they usually dry up by late summer. And because they dry up for part or most of the year even, they can't support fish. And that's really important because if there were fish in the pools, they would eat all the eggs and it wouldn't create a good habitat for them. So this makes them perfect for amphibians and important to protect as well. They're like nurseries for these amphibians. So they lay their eggs there, and then those larvae develop in the safety of those fish-free waters. Because they're temporary, they're also vulnerable. If these pools are destroyed or disrupted, it can have a huge impact on the local amphibian populations. So it's important to know that the vernal pools are there, document them. You can, most states even have a certification program where you can take photos of the pool, the location, the egg masses that are present, or the frogs and other things themselves, like fairy shrimp, things like that. But it can have a real positive impact if you know what's there and take the time to document it.
One of the things that I was thinking about when we were preparing for shooting this video was thinking about vernal pools. Are they always located in the same spot in the forest, or do they move around?
They're pretty much always in the same spot. There's some places that might be a vernal pool one year and not another. Like we just had a strong drought year. Although now there's a lot of snow melt happening here, so everything's pretty wet. But they pretty much are always in the same spot because they form in the depressions in the lowlands where things might, just the way you see, a puddle at the bottom of your driveway in the same spot all the time. It's kind of like that. They also rely on very specific conditions. So you need to have the right soil type, topography, and water sources so they don't just pop up randomly. They don't move around. And size and depth are really important as well. Those can vary a little bit year to year depending on rainfall and snowmelt. But some are so consistent that they've been used for amphibians for hundreds of years, right? Many, many generations. And that's why protecting these areas is so important. They're like ancient meeting grounds for these species.
So I think these are fascinating little locations in the forest. I also am a fan of nature trivia. And so I had asked you to do a little digging into what are some really unique or surprising facts about vernal pools that most people might not know. What did you find?
Well, for one, these are like genetic time capsules practically. Some of these species have relied on them for millions of years, like the fairy shrimp that I mentioned. And they're specially adapted to these temporary habitats. Vernal pools also can actually communicate with the species, so they generate particular characteristics like pH levels and other natural chemicals that might be in the soil. And some species like wood frogs have even learned to detect those species and use that as a signal to trigger that it's a safe place to reproduce. And that's what draws them there. They also, many of them have a really high site fidelity where they knew they were born in a place and they went off during their life, but they returned to that place to find others to mate with. They know that if it worked for them, hopefully it'll work for the next generation too. So these are like biodiversity hotspots. Even though they're small and temporary, they support a huge variety of life, from insects and crustaceans to amphibians and birds. They also are food sources for a lot of animals. So the loss of vernal pools can lead to the decline of not just amphibians, but also the species that depend on them, like birds and small animals. So it's really important to be informed about where development is allowed to continue responsibly.
I want to talk about all the little amphibians that rely on these vernal pools. I know there's some really unique species out there, and I want to start with my personal favorite, which many of our viewers are probably going to know of as well, and that's the spring peepers. So they are so loud for being such little frogs. And aside from those wonderful little singing voices of theirs, what else makes them so special?
Well, spring peepers are tiny little frogs, but their calls are anything but small. They're one of the first signs of spring, and their high-pitched peeps can carry on for miles. So I know we love to keep the windows cracked when you hear the spring peepers, because you hear them going, it doesn't go all night. They tend to go for a few hours and then quiet down. But usually when you're going to sleep, they're still carrying on. So they're really fun. So they're one of those first signs of spring. They're found all over the eastern U.S. and Canada, from the Gulf Coast all the way up to the Midwest and the Northeast. We're recording this in early March. I'm sure some places in the mid-Atlantic and southward are already hearing spring peepers. We should be hearing them in the next couple of weeks here. And they're really adaptable species that can live in a variety of habitats, from forest to wetlands. A lot of modern development practices have rainwater runoff and catch basins, and those, especially if they have small trees and stuff around them, can be natural breeding grounds for spring peepers. So a lot of modern neighborhoods have them as well. And as a fun fact, they have a special superpower where they actually create some of these frog species can create kind of a glucose-based substance in their bodies that allows them to freeze solid during the winter. So as soon as that temperature gets up above freezing and you get maybe a nice warm rain where they can continue to stay moist, then they'll come out and start their call.
That's so cool. I love them. I think the only amphibian that I love more, or at least as much as spring peepers, is, so we have a bullfrog that usually lives on the shore of the lake right near our house. And in the summer months, you can hear him singing his love songs into the night, just looking for his lady.
Just one, huh?
To me, it's just one. To me, when I hear the spring peepers, that really signals to me that spring has gotten here. And the next amphibian that I thought we would talk about is our daughter's favorite. And that's the spotted salamander. She has loved these things since she was an itty bitty little girl. Isn't that right? So they're part of big night migration too, correct?
They are, and they're one of the stars of the big night in our area. They have these striking yellow spots. They can grow up to 9 inches long, so they're practically, a mature spotted salamander is practically the size of your hand from the heel of your hand all the way to your fingertip. They also spend most of their lives underground, so you don't see them often, but on these first rainy spring nights, they emerge and make their way to the vernal pools, and they lay their eggs right in the water, and the larvae develop there in the water. And they're fascinating because they have a symbiotic relationship with algae. The algae actually lives inside of the egg masses and creates oxygen for the eggs to utilize in the development process.
That's really, really cool. So they have like these little oxygen factories
Yep.
in their eggs. Huh. You know, as you're talking and we're talking about amphibians, and I'm thinking more and more about frogs, I'm remembering, and I wonder if you remember it, a specific hike that we took when our daughter was little. And as we were walking through the forest, we heard this quacking sound. And she came across this little guy, this little frog. She used to call all the little animals.
It's just a little guy.
Look at this little guy. Do you remember that?
I do. I don't remember where we were specifically, but it was somewhere here in town on one of our conservation lands for sure. And it was a wood frog. So, we talked about the spring peepers, but we also have gray tree frogs and wood frogs. And each of them sort of come out on their own schedule. Like often on a big night, you'll have some of all of them, but they all do have their own timing. So you might have one week that it's all spring peepers, and the following week it's all gray tree frogs, and the next week it's all wood frogs, and I might have the sequence out of order. I feel like I have to relearn that every year. But they do have the wood frogs do have a really distinctive quack-like call, and they're one of the first ones, the early ones that emerge in the spring, often while there's still snow on the ground. So they're incredibly hardy. They can survive being frozen solid during the winter with that antifreeze process I mentioned. And these are found across the U.S. and Canada also, and they rely on those vernal pools for breeding.
Okay. All right. So I'm looking at our notes, and the next one on the list is one that I know you've mentioned to me before, but I think you said it was pretty elusive. I don't recall ever seeing one of these, and that's the eastern spadefoot. What's that amphibian about?
Yeah, this is also on my bucket list. I've not seen one either, but the eastern spadefoot is fascinating because it lives most of its life buried underground, and it's called a spadefoot because they actually have kind of a special toe that looks like a shovel that they use to dig a hole in the ground. And they are threatened here in Massachusetts because their habitats are being lost to development and climate change. And because they spend all of their time underground, they're often not detected, and therefore we don't always realize when development is disrupting their habitat. And they've got that unique foot that helps them dig into the soil. That's how they get their name.
That's sad to hear that they're threatened. I'm glad that we have so much conservation land in our town, because that always reminds me that all these little critters that are living on the conservation land are protected, right? So the next salamander on our big night list is the marbled salamander. So I don't think I've seen one of these either. But you had mentioned when we were going through these notes before we started recording that this one in particular has a unique breeding cycle, right?
Yeah, it's a little bit backwards from all the rest. These ladies lay their eggs in the fall, which is the opposite cycle from the rest. And then the eggs overwinter and then hatch in the spring instead of having the big night process. So we don't tend to see them on the big night the way that we do with all the other species, even though their eggs and their egg masses will be in the same vernal pools. They also are state listed as threatened in Massachusetts, so they're another one we need to keep our eye on. And they have these beautiful black and white marbled pattern, which makes them really striking to look at. So this is another one that's on my bucket list.
Now we have our list of animals to look for on big night, as well as one special salamander that you won't see going to a vernal pool on big night, though their eggs are likely in there. Next, I want to touch on something that you mentioned about a few of them, which is their conservation status, and unfortunately, some of them being on that threatened list. So what are the big challenges these amphibians are facing? And are you aware of any conservation efforts that are currently in play for these little animals of the vernal pools?
Yeah, their biggest threat is habitat loss. So whether we're putting in a road or a housing development, or even clear cutting a forest to turn it into agricultural land, that all of those activities would degrade the ability for the vernal pool to continue existing. So that's really important. And in Massachusetts and many other towns, but I'm more familiar with, states, but I'm more familiar with Massachusetts. This is what your local conservation commission is in control of, being aware and managing the permitting process for development. So oftentimes there's a buffer zone around any wetlands or around any vernal pools. So if there is a housing or a development permit that's being pursued, the Conservation Commission or the local authority for that can help the developer plan accordingly and either not permit in a given location or make sure that it's done responsibly to keep the vernal pools in operation. Climate change is also a big concern because it can alter the timing of breeding cycles and dry up vernal pools too quickly. So some of the vernal pools simply might not exist if the climate changes too much, or certain climate changes might make new vernal pools happen in places where they were not before, particularly if the rain cycles or the snowmelt cycles are really different. But we've had a couple of winters in a row now without very much snow, so there's not as much water runoff that then fuels the vernal pools. But luckily, vernal pools, they are pretty resilient and they're made to fluctuate, right? Every year is not the same as every other year. So as long as we're intentional about it, I think that's the main thing. There's also great conservation efforts underway, like protecting vernal pools through legislation, creating wildlife corridors to connect habitats, and citizen science projects like one called Frog Watch USA can also play a huge role.
Frog Watch, that sounds fun. How does that work?
Well, if you're looking for a unique hobby, I guess this is a good one. Volunteers get trained in person or online sessions to identify frogs and toad species by their calls. Then they go out to the local wetlands and vernal pool areas and other water bodies, typically during the breeding season, like February to August, and record the species that they hear. You can submit those observations to a national database, which is used by researchers and conservationists to track amphibian populations over time. And then that data helps to identify species and their movements so you can tell if they're growing or declining or facing threats. Volunteers can receive access to field guides, call recordings, and other resources to help them succeed. And a program like that fosters a sense of community among volunteers who often get a nice rewarding feeling from being able to contribute, work as a team, participate in local chapters, and it raises awareness about the importance of amphibians and their role in the ecosystem.
Okay. So I think this was a really fun topic. I really enjoyed this one. And so what I would ask of our viewers, let us know in the comments, do you listen for the spring peepers? And have you ever participated in a big night event? Do you think you might in the future now that you've heard about them if you weren't aware of them before?
And don't forget to subscribe to Hike and Hearth TV. As spring approaches and we start getting out on more adventures like a big night anytime soon, we'll be posting a lot of content showing what we find.
So, Dustin, we've talked a lot about animal behaviors on our YouTube channel, but sometimes those behaviors are misunderstood. For example, people often think that raccoons are washing their food when they have their food near a water source. But that's not what's really going on. So, would you like to walk us through what is actually happening if you see a raccoon putting its food into water?
Sure, and this is a good opportunity to show off some of the raccoon footage I caught a couple of summers ago on one early morning. But absolutely, raccoons are fascinating creatures because they're very active and animated. But this so-called washing behavior is a great example of how we sometimes misinterpret animal actions and equate them to human behaviors, or we anthropomorphize them, so to speak. But it's not about cleanliness. This is about their incredible sense of touch. So raccoons have extremely sensitive paws, and wetting these paws enhances their tactile perception. It helps them identify edible objects and navigate their nocturnal foraging. So it's sort of like they're able to see with their hands, and when they're wet, they can actually see better, so to speak. In captivity, when they're given water dishes, they even mimic these natural foraging movements, which creates the illusion that they're washing their food, which is completely unnecessary, of course.
Okay, so it's not about washing, it's about feeling their food. So now I'm curious about their paws. Like, what information, like, can you tell us more about how their paws function?
Sure, they've got these like little, think of them as tiny hairs called vibrissae, and they're it's these hairs that help them feel the different textures and shapes on their paws. When they wet them, it makes them more sensitive. So this behavior is really useful at night, in particular when they're foraging, so they can feel their way through the mud, the water, looking for food sources. It's a little bit like, if you're trying to detect the direction of the wind, you might lick your fingertip and hold it up to the wind because it allows you to feel the evaporation a little bit better.
Yep.
It's kind of like that.
Okay, I get it. All right. So this is interesting, and it's got me wondering, like, this is clearly an animal behavior that humans have misunderstood and kind of projected our human-like behaviors onto. Are there other animals that are misunderstood by humans in a similar way that you can think of at the top of your head?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch. So start with crows or some other birds have been observed like dunking their food in water. And again, it looks like you're washing it because that's what people might do. And we're a little, I don't know, hypersensitive to germs and cleaning our food, which is fine. That's a good, healthy biological instinct that we have, and it's paid off well for us. But when crows do it, it's more about sort of softening the food and making it a little bit more easily digestible, both to their stomach, but also in their beak, right? They don't have teeth per se. They can crunch something down in their beak and break it into some smaller pieces, but they can't necessarily chew it all the way up. So birds that do that, it's about softening their food. Otters is another example. They use water while they're foraging, but not for cleaning, and they float on their backs and use rocks to open up mussels or clamshells and things like that. So they're using different tools. And so many other examples, right? Squirrels pretend to bury nuts just to throw off thieves and protect their secrets. Beavers build dams not just to stop the water flow and create a home habitat for themselves, but also to kind of kill off the trees on the edge over time and make it so that there's more food sources readily available to them in or near the edges of their pond. So nature is full of surprises.
I kind of love how animals have figured out kind of how to use their environment to their advantage. Why do you think that myth of raccoons washing their food became so popular?
I think it's just because it's so human-like. When we see a raccoon dipping food in water, it's just easy to assume they're washing it just like people would. But there's cultural references, and raccoons have even been, in fairy tales and fables and different things like that. So those cultural references give it new life and passes it from human generation to human generation as we tell stories. But the truth is often more fascinating, right? It's about their incredible sense of touch and adaptability.
Yeah, and as we're talking through this, I don't know if any of our viewers are having kind of the same thoughts as I am listening to you, but it's making me think of even our own pets, right? So we have a cat, whose collar you might be able to hear jiggling in the background because he's just realized that we're occupied. So he, of course, wants our attention. But I used to think that when our cat would hop up on my lap when I was on the couch and start kneading, that he was doing that because he was content and trying to make himself a cushy little spot on my lap, or maybe showing me affection. And then I looked it up, and it turns out that that's just like a leftover behavior from when he was a kitten. And he would do that to stimulate milk production in the mother cat. That's what that is. So I projected this whole assumption onto that animal that wasn't really true.
Yeah, even the way cats bring you gifts like dead mice or something, which has happened from time to time here in our house. It's not really them giving you a gift the way that we would gift a tasty morsel to one another, but it's their way of teaching you how to hunt or showing you what the goal is in an effort to try to get you to contribute as well. So yeah, they see you as part of their family and they're trying to pass along their skill to you. Or you see dogs, for example, spin in circles on the bed before they lay down, and that's just tapping into their ancestral instinct to create a flattened space in the grass for themselves before they settle down for the night.
Yeah, it's really amazing how much of what our pets do is kind of rooted in their wild instincts, even though they're domesticated animals, just like raccoons and otters and the beavers that you mentioned also have their rooted behaviors that are tied to kind of their environments and their ancestry, right?
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear from our viewers on this too. Are there any other animal behaviors that you've seen or which seem human-like but have a different explanation? Maybe ones we didn't think of today. Or have you ever watched wildlife, even your pets, do something quirky? Let us know.
So that's all for today's episode. But before we head off on our next adventures, this is just a quick reminder to you, our viewer, that you can find Dustin's wildlife photography and links to all of our content channels on our website, hikeandhearth.com.
And we love being part of the YouTube nature lovers community. So keep sharing your comments on your experiences with nature, wildlife, and conservation. And if you're not already a subscriber, please be sure to join us.
Okay, Dustin, are you ready to send us off for today?
I sure am. Until next time, friends, keep your eyes on the skies and your hearts in the wild.